It's 4:15, so good evening all together. It's nice that you join our first meeting of our agriculture seminar this semester. At the moment we have 40 participants. Maybe we will have more people during the next minutes. I'm very happy that you join our seminar today and that we have a very famous and speaker, David Wüpper, who is really specialized on our topic of this semester, this year. We would like to discuss with you the question of farm size and sustainability. It's a quite difficult topic because maybe there's no other topic in which we have so different opinions in the society on the one hand, and in the agribusiness on the other hand. So farm size, small farms are perceived as more sustainable maybe by most people in the society, but in our sector we often think that bigger farms maybe are more professional, maybe also more sustainable. So it's not so easy to decide whether there is a correlation between farm size and sustainability in general, and in which direction this correlation goes. So it's a really interesting topic which we would like to tackle this semester with all of you. And yeah, we have organized this semester by different opinions. On the one hand, different speeches which are dealing with this topic from different directions, so as an interdisciplinary seminar. And we have at a last meeting, we have a more a talk about this topic by Gesa Busch, who has organized this seminar together with me. So thank you very much, Gesa, for all the effort to organize it. And we have also invited people from NGOs. So in our last meeting, for example, we have the opinion from our farmers young union organization. So in this seminar we have very different opinions about this topic of farm size and sustainability. We will have both presentations in English as well as in German. So starting today with first English presentation by David Wüpper. He will talk about the relationship of farm size and sustainability in Germany. David is now working at the ETH Zürich. So they're in the Agricultural and Environmental Economics working group at the Department of Environmental Systems Science. David has received a PhD in agricultural economics from the Technical University of Munich and a Master of Science in agricultural economics from the University of Kiel. He visited, for example, MIT and Berkeley during his PhD. He has got, for example, the award of one of the 20 most read articles of the Journal of Agricultural Economics in 2018, and an award for his PhD. And he really has published a lot during the last years. So we are very happy to have you here today, David. Thank you very much for not coming to Göttingen, but talking to us in Göttingen and presenting us a broad overview during your work. You has got a real broad overview about this question. As far as I understood, you will present us two of your works or work with colleagues together during our presentation here today. So the floor is yours. We are very happy to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here and to present this work. And I'm also really looking forward to the discussion because I think this is really a good topic for discussion. Can you all see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So yes, as was just said, I give the first presentation in this series, and the question is about the relationship of farm size and sustainability in Germany. And this is like the work that I present here from my own research comes from a project that I started when I was in Munich, and that was about the value of small family farms. So this, in German, we call this bäuerliche Landwirtschaft. So the interest was how are they different and what are the benefits that they are providing, and should small family farms be politically and especially financially supported just because they provide certain benefits. And the first thing, if you do research on this, and I'm pretty sure you are all aware of this, small family farms have a really good public image. So I think this is really an example of a business where most people are really willing to support this and think this is the best organization. We should have all our food production coming from small family farms, and most developed countries spend quite a lot of money to support small family farms. It's different in developing countries, but in the US, in Western Europe, small family farms are really seen as a very nice way of doing farming. And there are different reasons for this. Of course, the first one is simple sympathy. So if you think about, if you look at the pictures, if you think about a small family operating their traditional farm, that is a very nice image versus big industrial corporate farming that seems much more profit oriented, much less nice. So one thing is that people might just like small family farming. That's the first thing. But then there are also specific reasons why people might like small family farms. And that's usually that there are assumptions about specific benefits. So very often people think that small family farms are more sustainable, or they are better for rural life. Maybe trust and social capital is higher in places with more traditional family farming, or there's more employment created by small family farms. So there are a lot of very specific and testable assumptions or hypotheses about small family farms. And most of the research that I'm involved in, or that I will present today, is about the testing of these hypotheses. So if somebody claims that a small family farm is beneficial for landscape level, bird diversity, that's something that is testable. And I will present some work here, and I think the results are quite interesting because there are several papers that together provide quite a complete picture, I think, specifically regarding this question here. So the dimensions that I think are important to consider here are, first of all, whether small family farms are using different farming practices. So is it the case that a small family farm really uses fertilizer more efficiently, or they plant more hedges between their fields, or they use some other farming practices that are good for the environment? That is something that happens on the farm. There's also a more landscape structural dimension. So it could be that smaller farms have smaller fields, and this creates environmental benefits. So perhaps insects or birds prefer smaller fields because then they have more habitat. Or it could also be that it has nothing to do with the size of the fields, but in general, there is more land cover heterogeneity in landscapes that have more small farms, simply because all the small farmers make different choices. Somebody grows wheat, somebody grows corn, somebody has more forest on their farm. And if a lot of people make different decisions at the landscape level, there is more diversity, and that's good for birds, for example, or insects or other animals. And then the third dimension I think that's important is spillovers. So it could be that small family farms are much more sustainable in terms of their practices and also at the landscape level for biodiversity, but they might produce less. They might be less productive. There might be economies of scale or other reasons why smaller farms are less productive. And then what is produced less on these farms has to be imported from somewhere else and might create huge environmental costs. So that could overall be really negative if we find that small family farms are really good for the environment in Germany, but then we sacrifice Amazon rainforest to achieve that. So overall, that could be negative. So I think these are all dimensions that are important for a comprehensive assessment of the sustainability of small family farms. And I will especially talk about the first two today, but I will consider all three. So the lucky case that we have is that as people interested in Germany, we have a very nice natural experiment to really tease out, as I argue and others have argued, we have a mechanism that we can really tease out the causal effect of different farming structures. So you can imagine that in many countries, it's really difficult to identify the causal effect of farm size, or in general, small family farming versus big industrial farming. The problem are all these confounding factors. So you could imagine that in Germany, for example, in the south, we have this mountainous area, and in the mountains, the farms are smaller. Whereas in the north, where the topography is more flat, farm sizes are bigger. The problem is there are so many differences between North and South Germany. It's really difficult to say what's now the causal effect on sustainability versus all these other differences. You could imagine climatic differences, just topography. Maybe in the mountains, you have to use other techniques than near the coast. So, or in other countries, you might have that the big farms are just structurally and in terms of location, completely different from the small farms. So just with regressions and just with correlations, it's very difficult to tease out what's the causal effect of small farming. What we have in Germany is this nice natural experiment that for some time, Germany, as you all know probably, was divided into East and West Germany. And in East Germany, farms were forced to become big and industrialized. So the farmers didn't have a choice, but many small farms were just put into one big farm. And the interesting thing is this never went back, even after reunification. So even now that we have one whole country with one political system and one government, we still have it that the farms in the East are way bigger than the farms in the West. So just comparing East and West Germany would still not give us the causal effect, because as you know, East Germany is different from West Germany. East Germany, and you will see that in a moment, has differences in terms of rainfall, in terms of temperature, in terms of soil characteristics. So of course there are differences between East and West Germany, but the more you zoom into the historical border, the more those differences disappear. And that's what in the publication Wüpper, Wimmer and Sauer, and also Frederick Noack, with Levers, Kamp, and Larsen just now have done, we use a technique called the regression discontinuity design that is a regression technique that mostly uses the variation very, very close to some kind of border. So here, the border between East and West Germany, to say right at the border, if we see a discontinuity, that must be causal from whatever jumps at this border. And as we show in a moment, this can be used to show the jump in farm size that occurs exactly here, that is only for historic political reasons and not for reasons of geography or rainfall or those confounding factors. So with this setting, we can really tease out the causal effect of small family farms versus large industrial farms. And yeah, if you look at the map, it's really, it jumps into the eye. With the farm size, you can see where East Germany and West Germany have been. And the reason why I focus mostly on Nowak et al. And the study with me is because they are so complementary. Because in 2020, when we published our article, we looked at things on farm. We looked at practices that can be found in the German structural farm survey, things that farmers do on their fields. Whereas Nowak et al., they have looked at two data sets where bird diversity or bird richness has been measured. So they look at landscape outcomes. And I think that is really nice. And then something in between is also the study by Batari et al., which I will not discuss more, but they have looked at a field level biodiversity. So they have really measured biodiversity on fields in the East and in the West. So yeah, together, I think this gives us already quite a nice array of analyses that we can discuss. So just broadly, I don't want to turn this into an econometrics lecture, but just to give you a visual impression of how the method looks like. We say not all farms in the East are are large industrial farms, and not all farms in the West are small family farms. So this is similar, like you have a randomized control trial, like you have created your own experiment, but there is imperfect compliance. Not everybody has done as they should have. And this is the same what we have here, even though we say in general the farms in the West are smaller, it's not always the case. So we use instrumental variables and we use East and West Germany as the instrument. So in the first stage, you see that if you plot all the farms as a function of border distance, that generally we have a relative continuous distribution, but then we have this jump at the border, meaning that the probability that a farm is small and family-based is much higher in the West than in the East. And then you can use that to estimate in the second stage the causal effect of that. And if you have an image in your data that looks like the left picture, then there is no real discontinuity, meaning there is no causal effect of small family farming on this outcome. Whereas if you have an image that looks like the picture on the right, you have this big and sharp discontinuity. The area I marked in green, that would give you the causal estimate, the causal effect of a farm being small and family-based instead of large and industrial. So this is how we have done it. Nowak et al. Have just directly looked at East and West Germany, but in general, basically they skip the first part, but they do the second part just like we did. So the two studies are overall quite comparable, even though there are some differences between the study designs. The main assumption is that there is nothing else close to the border that is also discontinuously distributed, that could also explain why there is a location with small family farms and a difference in farming practices or biodiversity outcomes or other sustainability outcomes. So the two main threats would be either natural discontinuities, if the east-west border within Germany has been placed exactly where there is a natural discontinuity. So if on one side there is a mountain and the other is a valley, that would be a big problem. Or if rainfall would just jump. It doesn't matter if it continuously increases or decreases, but if it jumps, that's the big problem. Or because the East German border coincides with certain federal states, if those federal states would make very different agriculture policies, so for example, much higher or much lower agri-environmental payments. So we look at this, and Noack et al. Also look at this, and in general, we find that we have continuous changes within Germany. We don't have major discontinuities right at the east-west border. So it's not that rainfall jumps, it's just that rainfall continuously decreases from west to east. Same with temperature or elevation. And we have also looked at agri-environmental payments. They are also relatively comparable. So overall, there is a lot of evidence that we can use this historical east-west German border to tease out the causal effect of small family farming. And that's what both studies have done, both our in land use policy and the one in the HAE by Noack. Before we go into the main results of these studies, there are some interesting contextual factors. From our study, we have looked at the education level of the farm managers of the larger, less family-based farms and the smaller, more family-based farms. And what we find is that on average, the bigger farms have more educated managers than the smaller farms. So this could be in part be driven by the big East German farms being managed by professionals who are specifically hired to run these farms, people who have studied agricultural economics, maybe have a PhD and then become a farm manager or have a master's degree. So the levels here from 1 to 7, 7 is university degree, and I think 1 is just basic education. So there is this difference in education levels between the farm sizes. And I think this is quite interesting for several sustainability dimensions where education could make a difference. The other interesting difference is, this has been known, but it's again here very nicely illustrated by Noack et al. The West German farms don't have much different yields from the East German farms, but the East German farms achieve this with way less labor. So it seems that the East German farms are able to use labor-saving technology, which if you look at the differences, it likely comes from the East German fields are larger, so they can use more machines, and because the farms are larger, also machines are more cost efficient. So that's already some result, but it's not the main result that we're interested in. The main result that we're interested in is what happens on the farms and at the landscape level in terms of environmental outcomes. So in our study, we had 2 different kinds of how we thought about categorizing the farms. The first way is really simple. It's just relatively small, or how small a farm is relative to other farms that produce the same thing. So for all the dairy farms, we just calculated how much smaller is your farm compared to the average. In the second one, it's a little bit more complicated because here we really try to get this concept of bäuerliche Landwirtschaft, so this small family farming. And there we used a weighted average, again, of the relative smallness of the farms, but also family ownership and family labor share. So we really try to get all the dimensions that are in the literature, or the main dimensions. So both how family-based is the farm and then the size, because of course you couldn't imagine a huge family-run farm that would not be called bäuerlich. You could think of a small corporate farm maybe also. So I think for most people, the small family farm really is, you need all of these dimensions. And then just in the table, you can see that that works quite well, that West Germany has smaller farms and more family-based farms, and the East has larger farms and less family-based. For the choice of outcomes, we were, to be honest, quite restricted by the available data. So we work with a full farm structure survey from Germany. We found 4 indicators for sustainable farming practices in this data, and not much more. So these indicators included elements, which is whether hedges or trees or walls have either been created or especially conserved. So these are very important for many environmental outcomes. So in these hedges especially, there is carbon sequestered. Many animals use these hedges as habitats. They avoid soil erosion by wind and by water because they make the fields smaller and they are barriers to the movement of soil. This also helps to avoid pollution by agrochemicals because they are not just eroded away, but they're being kept at least then where the hedges are. So these structural elements play quite an important role. So we looked at whether there are differences between the different farming structures in this regard. Then we looked at bare land in spring. So again, for outcomes like soil erosion, it would be really good to have a cover crop or something to avoid bare lands. So we looked at differences here. Monoculture, it's in Germany, this is not a huge problem. It's not like there's a lot of monoculture going on, but it's recorded, and it's when certain crops, not all, like not in a vineyard or something, but if certain crops are grown 3 times in a row on the same field. Apparently, sometimes that is feasible. Very often it's technically not feasible, but sometimes it's feasible, and it should also be avoided. It is for several environmental outcomes not optimal. And then finally, diversification. There we computed a Herfindahl index. I wrote crop index, but it also includes dairy and some animal products, I think. But overall, it just measures how diversified is the farm in terms of how many different products is it producing. And this is good for the soil to have more different crops. It's also good for biodiversity, again, to have more structural diversity, more habitat. So we looked at these outcomes. As I said before, we used this full structure farm survey. The last round that had all of these 4 outcomes, some were dropped later, is 2010. We also have a lot of farm characteristics that we can use as control variables and for robustness checks on these things. It's not easy to access this data. So what we did is we prepared all our codes and we sent them to a statistical authority who ran all the codes. This was checked by different people who really made sure we are not finding any sensitive information about specific farms or there were a lot of privacy concerns. So this really took a long time. It was not the ideal way of working, but this was the only way we could access this data. And then what we were finding is not what we expected. So what we found was that the smaller farms and those that are more family-based actually have less of these structural elements. They have, so elements is measured binary, just whether they have it or not. So it's in percentage. So it's a 1% or 2% difference between the farms. The smaller farms or the more family-based farms have more bare land. Bare land is in percentage, so this is now percentage points. It's 6 or 5 percentage points. They have a bit more monoculture. It's just barely significant for the smaller farms, but for the family farm index, it's highly significant, and it's yeah, let's say roughly around 1% more percentage point more. And then the small family farms are more diversified by, so the Herfindahl index goes from 0 to 1, and that can be very roughly translated to percentage, like in percentage how diversified is a farm. It's not 100% correct, but it can be thought of like that, I would say. So we can say 6 or 8 percentage points more diversified. So I would say that is the only effect that's a little bit larger from all the effects that we are finding. So basically, it's a really mixed picture, right? It's these small family farms have less structural elements, more bare land in spring, a little bit more monoculture. So most of these are, if at all, they're rather negative instead of positive, but then they're more diversified. One thing that makes this a little bit more relative is that if you think that smaller farms have already smaller fields, maybe they don't need as many structural elements. Maybe it is more acceptable to have less structural elements if the farm and the field is already smaller, because then at the landscape level, it could still be more structurally diversified and everything could still be more smaller. Same with bare land. Probably bare land is not as important as long as your fields are small enough. So many of these outcomes, you could think, okay, for a small farm, they don't matter as much as for a large farm. So overall, you can say probably most of these differences are just very small. So it's not clear that you would necessarily use this to make agriculture policy and say we definitely need to support one over the other because we achieve major benefits here. So probably other dimensions are more important than this separation into small family farms. Sometimes in the literature it sounds like there are these amazing differences. Here for the farming practices, it might not be the case. However, the one thing that is really the elephant in the room is what about landscape level biodiversity? It could really be that that is the big difference, that really if you look at bird richness, bird diversity, that is really something where you find the big difference between the farming structures, because we all know that there are many birds that need another habitat than just pure cropland. So that could really be something else. And that's exactly what Noack et al. Looked at. So first of all, they show that indeed there is this really striking discontinuity in field sizes. So the larger farms in the East really have much larger field sizes. Crop diversity, exactly what we have found, crop diversity is much lower in the East than in the West. And if you just plot data from Ebird, so Ebird, I will talk about that in a second, is a citizen science project where people record which birds they have seen or heard. And if you plot that, you see a discontinuity that there is less bird richness in the east and in the west, discontinuously, exactly where the farm size jumps. And they do control for certain confounding factors here, like I think it's experience of the observer, the duration of the observation, and things like that. So this is relatively reliable. So, and they do use two data sets. So the first is Ebird, which is this citizen science project, which is really a large data set on what kind of birds can be found in different places in Germany. The one concern about Ebird is that it's not extremely systematic. It's not like a professional survey. So for that, the German common breeding bird monitoring is much better, because they really have these like a more sophisticated sampling strategy, and it's a little bit more professional. So it's good that they use both data sets, the one with more observations and the one that might be more reliable. And this is what they find. And I think this is really interesting. So the estimate is the discontinuity at the border. And they show here the results from different specifications. So the baseline is just, is there a drop in bird species richness if you go from the west to the east? And they find this. They find there are considerably less birds on the eastern side than the western side. So the estimate, the next is a standard error, then the p-value. The bandwidth is how close you go to the border, and you can statistically get the optimal border distance. So they say in one data set it's 7, and the other is 21. And then they show how many observations they have to the east and to the west. So in the baseline specification, they say there is a drop in -8.5, and I think they wrote somewhere it's -20%. So, and then they add control variables to see what they need to control for in order to really reduce this discontinuity, and then that might be the explanation for why we see this drop going from west to east. And the interesting thing is, when they control for land cover, so what's the land cover? That does not really make a difference in the estimate. It even slightly increases, but obviously it's basically the same. The interesting thing is, if they control for field size, also then the discontinuity doesn't really disappear. So it does not seem that field size is really the important variable here. When they control for crop diversity, the discontinuity is slightly smaller. So now it's 7.6 instead of 8.5, but it's still quite similar, right? And then the enhanced vegetation index, the EV, that can be thought of as a proxy for agricultural productivity. So also that does not make a big difference. The variable that consistently in their study makes a big difference is land cover diversity. And land cover diversity is this remote sensing product that categorizes pixels into pure cropland or mixed cropland or different kinds of forests or grasslands or build up, and like these categories. And land cover diversity seems to be much different in East and West Germany, close to the border. So these large farms create more land cover homogeneity. And that is apparently the reason why there is this drop in bird habitats. And they do some analysis on top of that. So they say the two big issues with these large farms in East Germany is the cropland extent and the land cover diversity, which are very much connected. Whereas field size and crop diversity are not really the main driving factors. Yeah, so that is really, I would say, the complementary result to our study. We don't find important differences on the farms, And interestingly, also Nowak et al. Don't find really interesting differences on the farm that have a big impact on the birds, but at the landscape level, there are differences. And now just to zoom out very quickly to the meta-analysis of Ricciardi et al., who do a meta-analysis at the global level, just to see what's the global pattern. And I think this is interesting to compare this just to what we have now learned about Germany. This is not necessarily perfectly causally identified. We don't have these nice natural experiments all over the globe. So many of these studies try to somehow avoid confounding factors, but this is mostly correlations, but it's still interesting to look at this. And the pattern is quite similar to what we have found. So the difference is globally, yields are often reported higher on smaller farms, but this has a lot of, this is a complete different topic. This is not as clear-cut as it looks here. There are a lot of qualifications required here. Overall, very often, overall productivity is actually larger at larger farms. So this is really is a little bit of a specific finding. The other findings are more reliable. There is more biodiversity on smaller farms, whereas resource efficiency seems usually to be higher on larger farms, and also larger farms are more profitable. So very often larger farms are more resource efficient and more profitable, but at the expense of biodiversity. And I think this fits very well to what we know now from Germany. So in summary, very often larger farms are more profitable. That's the reason why we have this trend almost everywhere towards larger farms. And that's why in many rich countries, so many resources are used to somehow stop this or slow this down and to help the smaller farms by having less stringent standards for smaller farms, or more programs or extension services or some kind of support for these smaller farms. All of this comes from the fact that the market drives farms towards being bigger in many places. Sustainable practices on farms so far, there have not been found major differences, but larger farms seem to reduce biodiversity. And I would say this is not so much a cultural story. Like in many publications, we find these stories about small family farms being very different culturally, that they think about their children. They want to give, when they die, they want to give the most environmentally healthy farm to the next generations. They think for many generations, they are more integrated into the society, and they have this like a whole different value and norm system. I don't think this is what the data necessarily supports. I think the differences that we do find are much more structural, in the sense that small farms have certain characteristics that just make them different from large farms. It's not so much that the managers have complete different modes of thinking. As I showed, a small difference might be education, but then we find that the larger farms have the more educated farmers who might be more able to be resource efficient and achieve a higher technical efficiency. So that would rather favor the larger farms. And I think now the big question for a discussion is, can we combine the strengths of the different farming structures? Can we actually have large, profitable, productive farms that do not reduce biodiversity? Can we create small, diverse structures on large farms without making them less efficient, without requiring additional resources? So we don't want to destroy all the advantages of the larger farms, but can we somehow in a clever way combine the advantages of these structures? Yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, David, for this really nice presentation and giving us such a broad overview about your own work, but also of your colleagues, and so presenting us a more broader overview here today. So, yeah, thank you very much for that. At the moment, I do not see any questions. There's the first one, Teja Chanke. Denise, could you invite Teja to join our discussion here?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you, David, for this very nice, very interesting presentation, which is very much in line, of course, of what we also found in our studies during the last years. First of all, I would like to ask you the scale dependence of your conclusions and also of your research. First of all, when you compare, for example, small farms with large farms, then on the same extent, you have many small farms and just one large farm. So on the landscape or regional level, it gives a wrong picture if you compare only one small farm with one large farm. So you have this diversification at least, let's say, tripled or 5 times or 10 times more in terms of crop diversification, in terms of, let's say, edges on small fields, etc. The same is also true for the bird study. I don't know exactly, at least I didn't get it, what the scale, the spatial scale of your analysis was. The smaller the scale is, let's say, 1 square kilometer, the more also the type of natural or non-crop habitat plays a role. For example, especially for birds, hedges and woody elements are most important, which can cause, let's say, an order of magnitude more species than just having grassy strips, for example. So this would be my first question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I fully agree with all that you have said. And that is exactly your first comment on our land use policy study, where you said we're comparing one small farm with one large farm. That's exactly how we discuss it. We say the fact that we find that the small farms are already more diversified in terms of crops on the farm, that means that as the landscape, that is multiplied. Because you have maybe 4 farms that are each more diversified than the one large farm, it's unlikely that they are all diversified exactly in the same way. So much more likely, there is even more diversification than on the same, let's say, 1 square kilometer in the landscape where you have the small farms and the large farms. And in the NOAC study, there you can see that. There is this really stark discontinuity in the diversification. So yeah, absolutely. In the NOAC study, the bird data, that's all at the pixel level. I don't know, from the top of my mind, I don't know the resolution exactly, but either way, there it's standardized. So that's really comparing pixels to each other, and the pixels with the small family or with the small farms, those pixels have more bird diversity than the pixels with the large farms.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. May I ask another question directly?
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, okay. Then I think when you think of on a global scale on smallholders or so, people living or having small farms, then the majority of farmers belong to small fields. I think something much more than 80% of all farmers live on small farms, which means that it may be, and this is the last questions that you put on your summary and discussion slide, may be very important to find out or identify those factors which can enhance productivity there. I think one point which one may also consider is that, of course, with these many crops and these small fields, you have a much higher flexibility and also resilience against, let's say, climate or environmental fluctuations, and also against price volatility on the markets, etc., which is also in favor of having these small farms, I would say.
Yeah, that's a really difficult topic. I just did a literature review on how to increase the productivity of smallholder farmers in developing countries. And yeah, the literature is really complex. So I think just because of the topic, so it's a good question. We could, of course, try to reduce the risk for these farmers. And I think that is really a win-win-win situation in many aspects. So we can, if we manage to deal risk better with better varieties, for example, with better insurance solutions, I'm sure we can make some advances here. But overall, with the crop diversity, there are so many benefits to have more diverse cropping systems. So it's a really difficult trade-off. And I don't have a good answer to this, except that this is a really interesting question with the small farms in developing countries. I think in many countries, farms are too small. So I think there are many instances where I would conclude that farms are too small to be viable, and they just face too many constraints in many dimensions. Because if you farm on less than a hectare, there are just many things that you can't really do, I think.
Yeah, maybe. I think in our situation in Germany, for example, you may also have a certain size, for example, very long fields where you still can work with big machinery, because it's, let's say, the breadth of the field is something like 25 meters or 30 meters, but very long. So you have a lot of edges and can still use this large machinery, for example. But of course, this needs a new land reallocation, what we just had in favor of large farms.
Yeah, I think long fields might be a good idea for certain things, or at least have certain shapes that are easier to work with, and at the same time provide some benefits because you have more edges. Yeah, so that's a nice thing. What I had in mind with the small farms is that very often, especially for contract farming, if there's a company demanding certain products, and then the farmer says, I can only supply so little that it's basically it cannot be profitable at this scale. I think that's really the problem, where I'm not sure how viable that kind of farm is.
No. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stefan van Kammer.
There we are. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. I have two questions. One is sort of just a small, maybe more technical thing. You used the natural experiment of East and West Germany, which is clearly a very, very interesting one. And I just wondered whether there might be, because of accumulated history of farming practices, a border there that you have to account for. The fact that, for example, in the former German Democratic Republic, for a long time, they were maybe using different intensities or different agricultural chemicals that maybe weren't allowed in the West and so on. And then that might have sort of an accumulated residual effect on biodiversity and other things that we observe now that maybe shouldn't be attributed purely to things like farm size or current land use practices. That's a more technical thing. The other more maybe economic or policy-oriented thing I wanted to ask is whether you are aware of work or whether you've done any work on economies of scale in policy implementation. I mean, if we want to get farms to do certain things and provide certain types of services, then there could be economies of scale involved there too. It might be a lot easier at the landscape level to work with 10 farms of 2,000 hectares each and to, sign contracts with them to monitor their performance and their fulfillment of the contracts, as opposed to, for the same 20,000 hectares, dealing with 400 farms that are 50 hectares each. Much more expensive in terms of monitoring and so on and so forth. So might there also be some issues there, aside from the more sort of natural science things that you were talking about? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great question. So the first question, that is a concern. That's why I put so clearly this assumption that there's no other discontinuity at the border except this farm size thing. So one thing I thought about a bit was cultural differences. What you said, like that, or at least I understood that maybe some farmers have different ideas about farming, and that's why they farm different. So just for historical reasons, I think, as far as I understand, many people managing farms or owning farms in East Germany are actually not historically East German traditional farmers, but very often they are coming from West Germany. They're coming from different places. So I think there has been quite some fluctuation. And if at all, I would say the East German farms are run so professionally and so optimized, I'm not sure how big a traditional legacy here is in terms of somebody is really using completely different farming practices just because of historical reasons and not because it's profitable. So I would assume that those differences are not that important.
Can I follow up briefly on that, please?
Yeah.
I was thinking more about accumulated past practices, the fact that in the former German Democratic Republic, maybe different agricultural chemicals were allowed or were used in intensities that weren't permitted in the West, for example. I remember this nitrophane scandal that we had at some point and so on. Obviously, there were some different farming practices in effect, and those might have residual or sort of lasting effects on things like biodiversity.
Yeah, absolutely. So that would be for the bird study, and there I think that could play a role, but I would not assume that is a very big effect, simply because they have all these additional analyses of the mechanisms. And they really test all these different mechanisms in various ways. And consistently, they find that the land cover diversity is the driving factor. Okay. So I'm not completely ruling out legacy effects from certain chemicals in the ground or so, but I don't think that's the main driver, because it looks like land cover diversity explains basically everything, and the rest is just random measurement error. That's how it looks like, because the coefficient goes from 8.5 to 1 point something. So I was quite convinced by the story. It's about the land cover diversity and not something specifically being in the ground. At least I think that's not the main effect. Mm-hmm. And then for your second question with the economies of scale and policy making, I think that's a really interesting thing that I have not done any work on. I have recently looked at agri-environmental policies in Switzerland, which are surprisingly effective and achieve quite a good cost-benefit ratio. So if at all, this would be an example for really small scale that is quite successful. I think in Germany, there are pros and cons. So I definitely think it can be easier to talk with 2 farmers instead of 20. So it might be much easier to find a common ground, common solution. I think sometimes it's the opposite, that these small farms are much more interested in agri-environmental themes and are much more willing to set aside or adopt certain farming practices, because they can almost add that to the diversification that they already have and just add some more things for where they get payments for, so they can really optimize their income in terms of what can I get a payment for, whereas many of these very large professional farms might not really be interested in this, and they say, we just make wheat and that's where we get our money from, and we are not that interested in changing anything into this very optimized system. So it would be an interesting study, I think, and I don't know anybody who has done this or is doing this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, you can ask your questions in 3 different ways. You can raise your hand like Teja Chanke or Stefan Kramon, or you can write your question in the chat or in the F&A section here. And Dominic Lemken wrote it in the F&A chat section here. David, I don't know whether you can see it. Thanks for the presentation. It seems we will have to trade off labor efficiency for environmental goals, or do you see a way to keep labor efficiency of larger farms on smaller structured farm plots? And here's a second question. My other question is on monoculture. You defined it as growing 3 times or more the same crop on a plot. You can also define it as a spatial crop diversity on a plot. How might that change environmental assessment of large versus small farms?
Yeah, thank you. So for the first question, yeah, that is indeed one of the central questions. Can we achieve the labor productivity or the labor efficiency from the farms in the East without sacrificing biodiversity for it? I don't know if people are doing specifically research on turning or mitigating these trade-offs. I think very often in agriculture we have these trade-offs where we have to choose, do we want to mitigate soil erosion or pesticide pollution or profits versus something else? I think sometimes there might be technical solutions, maybe with precision farming or just certain technological solutions. Maybe it's possible to mitigate this. That might be viable for some farms, not for all probably. Or what we just discussed with, is it possible to just restructure the large farms, make long fields that have a lot of edges? I mean, long farms then can actually have more soil erosion, for example. But I mean, if there are still hedges around, might be okay. So I feel I'm not the expert on answering this, but I clearly see that this is a really important question that should be tackled. We should find out how to realign efficiency with our environmental goals. And then, well, the way that we defined monoculture was just how it is in the official farm survey. So we just used the variables they collected, and they had this variable called monoculture, which they defined as growing the same crop 3 times in a row. And we could not change that. That was not in our control. If we would define monoculture in a different way, how would that change our results? I have no idea. I can absolutely not answer that question. as a spatial crop diversity on a plot. Yeah, I have not even the slightest intuition how that would change my results. Maybe you have an intuition.
Dominic, do you like to add something here directly? Denise, could you give Dominic the option?
Yeah, I have a bit of a loud environment. That's why I thought it would be a better idea to write. But no, I just think it's an interesting question to ask whether monoculture should be defined in that way, because of course you can have options that we talked about before, the smaller structured farms, just by having different kind of cropping systems, for example, row cropping or other approaches. And to some degree, they might be able to keep some of the efficiency in. They might not. I'm just was a bit thinking about whether there is also some indication on whether larger farms or smaller farms tend to rather use such approaches. So that was the question. I also don't know how to answer this. I just wanted to, was just hoping for some information here.
Okay, maybe we should go on then to Vitus Obermann.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for this nice presentation. I have a question about your crop farming and livestock farming, biodiversity aspects, because I think even smaller farms maybe have more livestock farming and therefore more biodiversity, sometimes regarding fertilizers and so on.
Yeah, so I think this would again be mostly about the study by Frederick Noack with the bird diversity, maybe. Again, I would say what you're saying might be true, but it's not the main mechanism driving their result. So I think from everything they have tested as a potential mechanism, if it's land cover diversity, their diversity is not something like animals versus crops, but the categories are crops of forest or mixed landscape. The animals, I wonder if they have anything where the animals come into play. I don't think they have any way to test that. It's just that the landscape diversity or the land cover diversity, since that seems to be the dominant or like the main explanation, I would say now everything else will not be the main explanation. Everything else might add a little bit and reduce those last remaining 1 point something of a discontinuity to explain that away too. But this big reduction from 8.5 to 1.5 or so, that is the land cover diversity, and everything else is then more a contributing factor, I would say.
Yeah, I also thought about the bird population, because the birds probably profit from the animals significantly more. So you don't use the livestock farming probably regarding the diversity of the crops the plants are used on the farms.
Well, so they have data on crop diversity, and that was not such an important factor. So they really made the story, it's mostly about cropland extent. So it's like you have these farms with very large fields and they're full with a certain crop, and then certain bird species, they just need a different habitat. So as long as there is some forest, some hedges, whatever they feel comfortable in, you need to have that in the landscape, and you have to have that enough in the landscape so that they can move within their habitat and have enough food and everything, so they feel comfortable. I don't know if there are certain bird species where it's a different story, and there are certain bird species there that need animals or different things. I don't know, could be.
Okay, the next question is from Reinhild Benning. Her question is, on which basis do you make the statement on the lesser importance of different farming cultures?
Yeah, that is just from our paper, where or basically from both papers. So what we find is there are these differences between the farm types, but they don't point into the direction that is usually hypothesized or assumed in these papers that talk about these cultural differences. So if we look at these papers that are often not written by economists but by other social scientists, they very often paint this very nice picture of small family farms where there are these parents and they are having this long-term plan for their farm, and they are also so integrated into the wider community. So they're not really looking for profit, especially not short-term profit, but they are really more concerned with what's right, like what should be the optimal management of this farm. And then soil fertility is very important, and not polluting the water, and not overstraining the natural resources and all these things. And they don't look so much for profit, but like they try to improve those dimensions. But then if that would be the story, we would not find that they have more monoculture and they have more bare land in spring and they have less structural elements on their farms. But if this would just in general be that they're always trying to improve those sustainability dimensions, they would have more hedges and so on. They would have less uncovered land. They would have, so they would do all these farming practices as good as they can. And for the landscape bird diversity, if this would be a cultural story, again, we would really find that things that the farmers do are a major mechanism. So not land cover diversity, but then we would really see, look, the main explanation is how many structural elements they put on their farm, or how many different crops, or what kind of crops they grow, or like in general, just the farming practices would then play a bigger role. That's where I base my interpretation on, that this is a structural thing and not a cultural thing.
So with culture, you also mean motivation or values?
Yeah, so I have other research. I'm very interested in regional cultural differences. I find that highly fascinating, that farmers in different regions might react very differently to the same economic incentives, that you can offer farmers the same economic incentives and they respond completely different to that because they have different values or different norms, or they believe in different things, or different things are important to them that have nothing to do with either risk considerations or just profits, but really that for some people the environment is more important, or long-term developments are more important. So I find those things very interesting, and I have done a lot of research on this also in Europe. that's a different paper. It's just that I think this question here is not that. As much as I'm fascinated by culture, my impression is this is not a culture story. I have a different paper where I find that the request for good agricultural practices in terms of mitigating soil erosion across European regions, that there regions with a stronger pro-environmental culture responded stronger to that. But that's a different, that seems completely independent from farm size or small family farms. That seems more like a really small scale regional story of different cultures in different communities.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Karina Meyerberg is asking, if I got it right, you only considered birds for your conclusion on biodiversity. Do you know other studies considering other animal species which come to a similar or different conclusion?
Yes, in a limited sense. So the Battery et al. Study that I mentioned very briefly in the beginning, they have sampled biodiversity quite comprehensively on a very limited number of farms, obviously, because they really went on the field and did a professional ecological assessment of how many different kinds of insects and spiders and these things they have found. So they do the study. It's not a regression discontinuity design. It's not the same method that we use here. So it's a little bit difficult to compare. But overall, I think here again, it would be interesting to do this at the landscape level if possible, probably not with field measurements. But I am not sure. Usually birds are the best covered. I think usually birds are really attractive biodiversity indicators because there are all these volunteers who really go out on the weekend and they write down exactly what they have heard and what they have seen. I don't think that exists for insects because the interest in insects is just so much lower.
Maybe Teja Chanke could add to that if you like, Teja. But otherwise, I have another question from Alkido Wanda. In your view, how could we link the idea of more efficient middle and larger farms in the east and in the north with the idea of traditional landscapes in West Germany, especially in the south? If we look to the tropics, differences between farm size vary even more. And there's a lot of dynamics happening where smallholders are often moving out of agriculture.
Okay, let me see. It's a long question.
Yeah, that's right.
I was in the wrong. Which one is it here?
In the chat. It's in the chat.
Here. More efficient in the east and the north. I mean, the farming structures between north and south, especially in Germany, are quite different. So very often there completely different things are produced. Like we have these small mountain farms in Bavaria versus large scale pig farming more to the north, or large scale dairy. And there it's really difficult to establish causality if we compare east and north and south. So the nice thing with east and west is that there we have more of a grasp of causality. So it's difficult for in the other way. And that is even more so in the tropics, because my impression is that really in developing countries, the differences between farm sizes are so fundamental and linked to so many other things. So there's all this ongoing research on this inverse farm size productivity puzzle, that very often it's found that the smaller farms have higher yields or are more productive, and there are all these complications. There's just one study that came out now from I think it's Diego Restuccia. Either way, it's that they find that there are certain market imperfections that correlate with different farm sizes. And if you take into account that, then the relationship reverses. The same is with a lot of constraints. Very often the very small farms are operated by very poor families that just barely make a living from these small plots, whereas the very large farms are operated by urban elites who are growing cash crops for export to Germany and Switzerland. So it's really difficult, I think, here to compare these different farm sizes and see what's causal and what's not.
Shower Yu is asking, do you think plot size and farm size, if plot size is smaller, is it more sustainable?
So what we see in Germany is that the small farms have small plots on average. On average, the smaller farms have smaller plots. If plot size is smaller, is it more sustainable? So that depends a little bit on what you're looking at. For some environmental outcomes, a smaller plot can be beneficial. So in general, a smaller plot will have less problems with soil erosion. So if you farm a slope and it's not covered by any crop for some time, let's say you farm corn on a slope, and then you have a large plot or a small plot, the large plot will have more soil erosion. So there it would be really good to make the plot as small as possible. Again, for the bird study, they did not find that the plot size per se was so important for the birds. There it was other factors. So it really depends. But then small plots are often less efficient. Often you need more labor. You cannot farm a small plot the way that you can farm a big plot. So very often farmers prefer a very large square plot where they can use big machines that can often be much more profitable. So there is this trade-off.
Hans Asmus Otto is asking also a very interesting question. Doesn't it also play a role that small farms partly cultivate highly populated areas at the west, and the large agricultural enterprises in the east of Germany mostly operate in less populated areas, and this factor maybe has a great influence on biodiversity, so population density?
Yeah, close to the border, that is less of an issue than in general. So we all know that many places in the east are much less densely populated. Close to the border, and in the NOAC et al. Paper, they also have a graph for that. That is much less of an issue. That's one of the advantages, so to really focus on a small band around this historical border, where also things like population density are more comparable. But more generally, further away from the border, I'm sure that has an effect, especially for the composition of the birds, I would say, because there are some birds who are completely fine with urban places, but there have been studies showing that especially very modern buildings are quite bird unfriendly. So there's not much habitat in a very modern settlement with very few places for breeding and so on.
Okay, a second question from Reinhard Benning. Reinhard, would you like to ask it directly because it's a longer question, or should I read it? Okay, let me do it. A second question. In the global socio-economic discussion, a double labor force per land unit is considered as a benefit for sustainability because it secures incomes, often family incomes. I could not find any disadvantages in your comments with view on productivity either. Jobs in rural regions in Germany also have sustainability value from a socio-political point of view. How did the labor force factor enter into your assessment?
Yeah, good point. And that is another benefit that's very often stated, that small family farms are creating jobs in rural regions. So here in this paper, we have really just focused on environmental outcomes, and we don't use the labor efficiency or any social or other outcomes for this assessment. So this is really, here we are looking at biodiversity and certain farming practices. We have a companion paper published last year in the European Review where we look at the job creation effect of small family farms. And there we find nothing, which I think is plausible simply because even in rural areas, the farming sector in Germany is really small compared to the overall labor force. So saying we want to support farming to create jobs is probably a very inefficient way compared to how cost efficiently we can create or conserve jobs outside of farming. Simply because farming is so small. I mean, it's really so few people work in farming. So if there's one more person working on the farm, that's good for that person, but it's politically not the best way to create employment. The labor efficiency argument is simply from the view of the farmer. So if you run a farm and you can produce the same output with one more or one less person you have to pay, it's clearly better for the farmer to produce the same outcome with paying one less person. Labor costs are quite important for farms. So that's the viewpoint here.
So Teja Chanke has written here about a paper from Sirami et al. From 2019, where other regions and are covered, and insects are covered in this paper. So this is only interesting literature which we could take a look at. But here's another question from Xiaowa Yu. If it is possible that small farms over-report, or is it possible that small farms over-report production, larger farms under-report production? It happens in developing countries. Maybe the same is true for Germany?
Yeah, that's the systematic measurement error that is indeed quite prevalent in developing countries. I don't think this is really a big issue in Germany. I don't think we have systematic measurement bias that the smaller farms in Germany systematically misreport. So I think in this regard, these official German farm structure surveys are quite reliable. There is clearly measurement error, but I don't think it's systematic in that way. Like I know that in many developing countries, people really, they don't know how big the fields are. So they just guess. So they just think, okay, they have never measured the field, they have never bought it, and then they think this looks like it's 10 meters or 100 or 1,000, but these are very rough guesses, and the same happens with the output. So dividing output by area is really a rough guess. I think this is really different in Germany, where these things are so meticulously measured. So I don't think this is a big problem here.
Okay, I think we really had a nice discussion, really interesting questions. Thank you all for participating. And thank you, David, especially for your really nice presentation and your precise answers in our discussion. So this was really a great starting point here for our semester seminar. Next week, we will have Alfons Bahlmann here. Alfons Bahlmann is talking about large-scale agriculture, large-scale farming. Alfons is really an expert on large-scale farming, especially in Eastern European countries, as well as on a global scale. So I'm quite sure that we will have interesting discussion next week also. So I would invite you all to participate. The next week's lesson is in German language. So yeah, for all of you who understand German, this is, I think, a real great opportunity to go on with our discussion, but we will have then the next presentation by Robert Finger again in English. So, David, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to discuss with you, and thank you all for participating. See you next week here. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.